The murder of one person is an enormous tragedy for the entire family. The murder of an entire family is a tragedy for all of society. But what if the person responsible for wiping out a whole family turns out to be someone no one in society, or even the family itself, would ever have suspected? And even the perpetrator himself never expected such a heartbreaking outcome. This is the tragic story of the Mori family, a story that will make you think twice about your own actions, so that, in trying to do good, you don't make fatal mistakes. Help this channel grow. Like the video, try the new hype feature, leave a comment, and subscribe for more stories. This helps us a lot. Thank you. It was a bitterly cold night in Fishkill, New York, a town known for its quiet streets and family neighborhoods. But in the early morning of January 19, 2007, the usual silence of the town was shattered by total chaos. Red and blue lights flashed, sirens wailed on a normally peaceful road as emergency vehicles pushed through thick clouds of smoke rising from a two-story house on Route 82. Passing drivers stopped. Some tried to help, while others simply froze in place. Not so much because of the cold winter air, but because of the fear they felt watching firefighters enter the burning home. Neither years of training nor the experience of putting out countless fires could prepare the rescuers for what awaited them in those smoke-filled rooms. As the firefighters made their way upstairs through the thick smoke, one of them bumped into something soft. He quickly scooped the lifeless body into his arms and carried it out into the fresh air. When the rescuer stepped into the light, the full horror of the tragedy became clear. In his arms was a child. To the firefighters' horror, the little boy had not only been harmed by fire and smoke, his tiny body was covered in wounds, clear signs of a brutal attack. Before the firefighters could recover from the first shock, another small body was carried out of the house, and then another. Each one bore traces of unimaginable violence. And the horror didn't end there. This was not an accidental fire. This was a deliberate massacre. Everyone has seen those perfect family photos on social media. Mom, dad, and kids all wearing matching sweaters, smiling sweetly, with the dog lying at their feet. You look at that flawless picture and think everything in that family is perfect, that they all love each other and are truly happy. That's exactly how the Mori family appeared from the outside. On the surface, Tony and Tina looked like a classic American couple. Tony was the kind of dad who spent weekends riding ATVs in the woods with his sons instead of lounging on the couch in front of the TV. Tina was a cheerful, outgoing mom whose warmth enveloped not just her kids, but everyone around her. She had an energy that drew people to her like a magnet. Tina was the mother of 3 boys. Tony Jr., Adam, and Ryan formed their own little suburban dream team. Each had his own personality and interests: football, baseball, cartoons. They were ordinary kids with their own dreams and desires. Let's go back a few years to get to know the Mori family better. Manuel, whom everyone called Tony, and Tina met in the early 1990s. They soon married and were now raising 3 sons. Their firstborn, born in July 1993, was named Manuel after his father and grandfather, but he was better known as Tony Jr. A few years later, in June 1996, their second son, Adam, was born. And in October 2000, Ryan arrived. The Mori family lived in Fishkill, New York, a small town with a population of just under 23,000. The people of Fishkill felt safe and comfortable. It was the kind of place where people moved to slow down, start a family, and buy a cozy little house with a backyard perfect for neighborhood barbecues. That was exactly the life Tony and Tina dreamed of. They rented a home at 203 Route 82, and the neighbors quickly welcomed the new family into the community. The Morris were seen as good people, reliable tenants, and a perfectly ordinary, close-knit family. The 3 boys were the light that made their parents get up every morning. Tony Jr. was the most outgoing kid. He played football and wrestled. Adam, the middle child, was the funniest. He cracked jokes at every opportunity and always tried to make everyone around him laugh. He loved baseball, while Ryan, the youngest, was the sweetest, gentlest little boy who still loved Saturday morning cartoons and looked up to his big brothers. The boys were especially close with their grandfather Manuel, who loved spoiling his grandsons and playing silly pranks on them. For example, after they all watched Alien together, Grandpa pulled out his dentures, scaring and amusing the boys at the same time. He affectionately called them the Three Stooges because they were always getting into mischief and keeping him on his toes. But when Grandma died after a long illness, it was the boys who supported Manuel the most. Tony Jr. was in middle school, while Adam and Ryan attended the same elementary school. For a while, everything in the family seemed stable, but Tony wasn't satisfied with their financial situation. He wanted more for his kids, so in 2006 he tried starting a business with one of his closest friends. Unfortunately, nothing came of it, and Tony became even more disappointed in himself. The Morris tried to keep up appearances that everything was fine, but the problems that had started creeping in back in 2005 were snowballing. They fell behind on rent. Tina worked as a cashier at a small store, and Tony took on any odd job he could find. Yet there was still never enough money. The Mori family had always lived modestly. No designer clothes, no expensive cars. But now, even basic expenses were hard to cover, and financial stress can hit even the strongest relationships hard. The Morris still attended their kids' games and school events. Tina still posted cheerful updates on social media, and no one around them yet suspected the family was going through a serious crisis. But soon the landlord noticed the house wasn't being kept up like before. The rent debt kept growing, and eviction talks began. The boys also sensed tension in the home. Though their parents never spoke openly about it, all the signs of an approaching disaster were there. Tony started drinking more and staying out late. He wasn't just drinking, he had begun using drugs to cope with stress. Then Tony occasionally started selling cocaine to friends because he was desperate to keep the family from losing their home. He probably never even considered the risk. It seemed like a small side hustle with huge consequences. He thought everything was under control, that the problems were temporary, and he'd fix it all. To protect the kids and the family's reputation, he kept his bad habits hidden from everyone around him. But in a small town like Fishkill, secrets are hard to keep, and people started whispering that something wasn't right in the Mori family. All this time, Tina was torn between hope and reality. Her life revolved around her sons, their safety, and their future. Meanwhile, her husband stayed out late, got drunk, and barely cared about his wife. Tina began confiding in friends that she might leave Tony until he got himself together. She talked about moving to another state, putting some distance between them to show Tony what he risked losing if she and the boys left. The young woman dreamed of going to law school to secure a stable future for her family. The life she imagined wasn't this chaotic. Tony and Tina's marriage wasn't a failure. They loved each other. It was just that resentment had started to build. Tension and stress ruled between them. Tony knew he was ruining everything, that Tina was pulling away. But his need to escape reality with drugs had turned into a real addiction, and it kept him trapped. By late 2006, Tony Mory was 33, and his wife, Tina, was 30. Their sons were growing up fast. Tony Jr. was already 13, Adam was 10, and Ryan was 6. The new year, 2007, was supposed to be a fresh start, setting goals and achieving them. Each of the boys had his own dreams, and no one could have imagined what would happen in 2007. On January 19, 2007, at 4 a.m., several frantic 911 calls reported flames pouring from the back of the Mory house. Most people should have been asleep, but 2 passing drivers spotted the fire. One after another, they pulled over, jumped out, and ran to the house, pounding on doors and windows, shouting desperately to wake those inside. Multiple fire departments responded. When they arrived, the back of the house was fully engulfed, thick smoke pouring from every window. Firefighters entered through the front door, where the flames were less intense, and headed upstairs. But the situation grew increasingly tense. Every room was filled with dense smoke. Heat was rising, visibility dropping. Wearing oxygen masks, the rescuers slowly pushed through the dark smoke until they reached the staircase and climbed to the second floor. On the landing, they saw two doors, one on the left, one on the right, so they split up. One firefighter opened a door and immediately dropped to the floor to crawl toward the bed. When he banged his head on the bed frame, he turned on his flashlight and saw the outline of a small body on the pillow. He realized it was a child. The firefighter grabbed the lifeless body and raced outside, hoping he wasn't too late. Only when he laid the boy on the ground did he see the pajamas covered in bloodstains. The child was later identified as 13-year-old Tony Jr. The house was large enough that if one child was inside, the parents had to be somewhere too. The firefighter rushed back into the burning building to search for others. He returned to the same bedroom and found a second child lying under one of the windows. Tragically, this boy was also dead. It was 10-year-old Adam. Despite multiple fire trucks on scene, flames still shot from the house. Rescuers searched every room to make sure no one else was inside. While checking the first floor, they found a third body in the dining room. Unbelievably, and to their horror, it was the third child, even smaller than the first two. The boy was carried out and laid on the ground. The firefighters knelt beside the boys' bodies, stunned, because it was clear all three had died not from smoke inhalation. Someone had inflicted multiple wounds on them. Seasoned rescuers had never seen anything like it in their careers. They were in shock and disbelief. Since this was no ordinary fire but a crime scene, police were already on their way. The first detective arrived while firefighters were still battling the remaining flames. A red tarp lay on the ground in front of the house, covering the bodies of 13-year-old Tony Jr., 10-year-old Adam, and 6-year-old Ryan. The detective had to figure out what happened here. While firefighters finished their work, the officer canvassed neighbors, asking who lived in the house. When told it was the Mori family of 5, the detective approached the rescuers and explained that 2 more adults should still be inside. Once the fire was out and the smoke began to clear, firefighters conducted a more thorough search. They soon discovered a 4th victim in the living room. However, the body was so severely charred that it was impossible to identify gender at first glance. The 4th body was eventually identified as 30-year-old Tina Mory. Her 33-year-old husband, Tony, was the only family member still missing. As investigators examined the scene, they found no obvious signs of forced entry. Fire and smoke damage was everywhere, but the back of the house, where Tina was found, suffered the most. Upstairs, where the boys were found, blood splatters and pools covered much of the bedroom floor, and a bloody adult handprint was visible on one wall. After photographing all evidence in the house, New York State Police investigators began examining the surrounding area. Though the firefighters had left many footprints, fresh tire tracks and a strange patch of melted snow stood out, like a vehicle had idled there long enough to melt the ice. Someone clearly wasn't in a hurry. About 20 minutes after the house fire, another 911 call reported a burning car on the roadside less than a mile away. The vehicle was parked on Lime Kiln Road near Route 82. Firefighters rushed to the scene and found a fully engulfed 2003 Kia. They suspected a connection. First the house, then a car nearby. After extinguishing the flames, thankfully, no one was inside. Investigators ran the plates and discovered the Kia was registered to Manuel Mory, Tony Mory's father. Searching the area, officers found several .22 caliber shell casings right under the seats and a blood-soaked pair of gloves tossed into the snow nearby. The burned car was now a second crime scene. Whoever left the evidence behind clearly hoped it would be destroyed in the fire. The perpetrator was in a rush, trying to disappear unnoticed. At first glance, with 4 family members dead and Tony missing, plus his father's car burning nearby, it looked like Tony might have done the unthinkable. Maybe he snapped, killed his entire family in a rage, set the house on fire, drove off, and torched the car to destroy evidence. But it didn't take investigators long to realize that theory didn't hold up. The medical examiner examined each body and, while examining Tina's remains, discovered something shocking. As mentioned earlier, her body was so charred it was initially unidentifiable. But as the examiner tried to make sense of inconsistencies, he realized he wasn't looking at one person, but two. The couple had burned so severely that Tony Mory's body had literally fused to his wife's. They were locked in a final, fatal embrace. They were holding each other when they were killed and then burned. The medical report described how they had melted together, giving the impression of one person when there were actually two. So now Tony had to be considered another victim. All 5 members of the Mori family were confirmed dead. The burned Kia registered to Tony's father was also tied to the case. Investigators now knew Tony hadn't been driving it. Authorities faced an extremely complex situation with far too many unanswered questions. Tina had to be identified through dental records due to the condition of her remains. Her body was so damaged by fire that tracing bullet paths or fragments was nearly impossible. Still, it was determined she had been shot 3 times. Once in the back of the head, once in the chest, and once through the palate. Her husband, Tony, suffered a fatal gunshot wound to the neck. Like Tina, the condition of his body made determining the exact bullet trajectory very difficult. Their eldest son, 13-year-old Tony Jr., suffered over 80 stab wounds, many classified as defensive. The boy fought so desperately that the killer clearly lost control. Both Tony Jr. and his 10-year-old brother Adam died from multiple stab wounds to the face and neck. 6-year-old Ryan suffered combined trauma. He was struck on the head with a heavy object and also stabbed. The doctor noted that Ryan's blood carbon monoxide level indicated he was still breathing when the fire spread through the house. So in addition to his other injuries, the fire contributed to his death. The next morning at 9:30, Tony Jr.'s teacher called his grandmother, the emergency contact, because the boy hadn't shown up to school and his parents weren't answering calls. Tina's mother, Arlene, had no idea her daughter and entire family were dead. The school employee told the grandmother that students were talking about a fire on Route 82, but no details were known. Arlene had already tried reaching her daughter and son-in-law with no answer on home or cell phones. She thought it strange. By noon, all relatives had heard about the tragedy, but no one knew exactly what had happened to the Mori family. The family was so worried they gathered and went to the police station hoping for answers. But even there, they were told nothing concrete. Tina's mother, Arlene, and her husband waited in the hallway for news from investigators. Arlene grew so tired of waiting, she decided to go to the hospital. If her daughter and grandsons were there, she needed to be with them. Unfortunately, police knew all 5 Morris were dead, and not in a hospital, but in the morgue. They couldn't bring themselves to tell the family. When Arlene headed determinedly for the exit, an officer had to stop her in the hallway and say there was nothing more she could do for her loved ones. Finally, the officer was forced to deliver the heartbreaking news that all 5 members of the Mori family were gone. As expected, Arlene collapsed right there on the floor, unable to process the horrific truth. Once she was revived, she called the rest of the family and, through tears, told them everyone was dead. Arlene felt utterly lost without Tina and the boys. They had been the meaning of her life. The hardest was for Tony's father, Grandpa Manuel. He had been closest to his son's family. The night of the fire, Manuel had been working the night shift. The next morning, 2 investigators showed up at his door to inform him that his 2003 Kia had been found burning on the roadside. He explained he had given the car to his son back in 2005. At first, he was completely confused by the police visit, but when one detective told him about the fire at the Mory house and that no one survived, Manuel was devastated. The news was the second blow after losing his wife. His grandsons were what kept him going, but Grandpa didn't yet know they hadn't just died. They had been brutally murdered. Not only relatives, but everyone who knew the Morris were in shock and couldn't understand who could commit such a crime. Grief counseling was arranged for the boys' schools. The terrible tragedy shook all of Fishkill. People feared they could be next. Meanwhile, the investigation began. Detectives combed every inch of the house and concluded an accelerant had been used to start the fire in the rear. Given the victim's injuries and the amount of blood in the boys' bedroom, investigators suspected the killer may have been cut or injured during the attack. They began calling local hospitals to see if anyone had recently sought treatment for such wounds. Authorities also asked the public to report any unexplained injuries among acquaintances. In the days that followed, the area around the burned house became a memorial. Along the wooden fence surrounding the ruins, people left flowers, stuffed animals, and notes with photos of the boys. On Thursday, January 25th, with state police permission, the Mory home was demolished. By then, detectives and experts had collected all significant evidence. Now they had to find the killer. Investigators used every resource available. One key lead came from a New York State police officer patrolling Route 82 the morning of the fire. His patrol car was equipped with a mobile license plate reader that captured every plate in view. This allowed them to track which vehicles were near the Mory house around the time the fire started, before 3 a.m. Route 82 is the main road through Fishkill, New York. The system captured thousands of images, so reviewing them was a slow, meticulous process. Processing the data took time. Teams conducting witness interviews agreed Tony Mory had a drug problem and may have been involved in selling. Could that have been the motive for such a brutal attack? It wasn't about painting the victim as a bad guy, but about understanding his lifestyle, where he went, who he associated with. On January 29th, just 10 days after the fire, a major breakthrough occurred. Local teens playing hockey on a frozen lake lost their puck in bushes near the shore. While searching, they found a blood-soaked hunting knife and immediately called police. The lake was only a 20-minute drive from the Mory house, so police called in divers to search the water. They recovered several highly relevant items: blood-stained boxer shorts with hearts and kisses, a locked metal box, a firearm, blue pants, and long shorts. Everything was sent to the New York State Police Crime Lab. Detectives now had a mountain of evidence, but still no clear suspect. However, the metal safe was confirmed to belong to Tony. Relatives verified he kept it under his bed. Since there were no signs of forced entry at the Mory home, investigators believed the victims knew their killer, possibly someone they trusted. Naturally, detectives looked closely at everyone close to the family. That brought 18-year-old Francis Cannon under suspicion. The troubled teen had been expelled from multiple schools and had a criminal record. Despite his issues, Tina had taken Frankie under her wing and treated him like another son. He slept on their couch, ate at their table, and essentially lived with them for weeks before the murders. Had Tina's kindness become the tragic reason her entire family was killed? Could Frankie, a difficult teen with a dark past, have done something so horrific to people who had shown him nothing but generosity? However, Francis was quickly cleared when it turned out he was in jail at the time of the crime. 3 days earlier, he had broken into the high school for thrills. He called it a bad joke that landed him in county lockup. Still, Frankie told police about the safe under Tony's bed, where, he said, cash and cocaine were kept. The young man said Tony was very careful and never spoke of it around the kids or Tina to shield them from that side of his life. Frankie swore he never told anyone about the safe, but when the kids were at Grandma's, people often came to the house to buy drugs. Though he had a bad reputation, Frankie genuinely loved the Mori family and was devastated by their deaths. The investigation was back to square one. Tony clearly lived a secret life his wife and children knew nothing about. So who else knew about his addiction and financial vulnerability? Detectives started asking around, and one name kept coming up: Charles Gilio, an old friend of Tony's from high school. After graduation, they stayed close, riding ATVs together, having barbecues. Friends and neighbors described Charlie and Tony as inseparable brothers. Detectives wanted to ask Charlie a few questions since he would know a lot about his friend. But the man showed little interest in talking to police. That surprised the officers, but what interested them more was the fresh cut on Charlie's forehead. Gilio claimed he got it riding an ATV in the woods, but that didn't match his story of wearing a full-face helmet. According to Charlie, the night the Mori family died, he was drinking at home all night with his buddy Mark Serrano, a sanitation worker, and never left the house. Then another detail emerged. The lake where the bloody clothes, safe, knife, and gun were found was right near Mark Serrano's house. Coincidence? Or were these two somehow involved in wiping out an entire family? Since Tony occasionally bought drugs, police tracked down his supplier, who said he sold cocaine that night to two of Tony's friends, Charles Gilio and Mark Serrano. Clearly, the dealer's information contradicted what Charlie and Mark had told police. They had lied about their whereabouts. Using the mobile license plate reader data, investigators checked whether Serrano's or Gilio's vehicles were near the Mory house during the crime. Mark Serrano's car was there. As detectives built their timeline, they learned Tony and Charlie had recently fallen out badly over drugs. Tony had even told Gilio to stay away from him and his family. Physical evidence backed up the suspicions. DNA tests on the items from the lake came back positive. Adams and Ryan's blood was on the shorts. Tony Jr.'s DNA was on the blue pants and the heart print boxer shorts, recognized by Mark Serrano's girlfriend, who had given them to him 3 years earlier for Valentine's Day. The gun matched the one used to shoot Tony and Tina, so those clothes most likely belonged to the killer. As the investigation progressed, more evidence surfaced. Phone records showing calls from Charlie to the Mory house that night, the meeting with the dealer, car seat covers stained with the Mory brothers' blood found under Serrano's sink, and Tony's blood on the floor mat of Mark's car. At first, when Mark Serrano was brought in for questioning, he insisted he and Charlie were never at Tony's house. Then he admitted they had called Tony asking where to get more coke. Only when detectives pressed him did Serrano confess he drove Charlie to the Mory house, but stayed in the car. He couldn't explain how his distinctive boxer shorts ended up soaked in victims' blood and dumped in the lake behind his own house. According to Mark, he waited 2 hours before Charlie came back out. Instead of getting into Serrano's car, Gilio took Tony's Kia and drove off, the same Kia that later burned. Mark didn't know what had happened inside, so he just followed Charlie. He saw Gilio get out of the Kia, toss something onto the front seat, and then the car went up in flames. In later interrogations, Mark Serrano gave several more conflicting versions of that night. Finally, Charlie Gilio was arrested and his home thoroughly searched. Nothing incriminating was found there. Charlie stayed silent. From the moment handcuffs went on until he was driven to the station, he didn't say a word. He invoked his right to remain silent. Later, once in a cell, he told detectives he didn't do it, and if he did, he didn't remember. By then, experts had examined the bloody handprint on the boy's bedroom wall. It perfectly matched Mark Serrano's right palm, directly linking him to the attack on the Mori family. This was direct physical evidence, and police now had enough to hold the suspect. A long, intense, and exhausting 9-hour interrogation followed the arrest. Despite all the evidence, Serrano stuck to the same story and maintained his innocence. When asked how his bloody handprint ended up in the room where 2 brothers died, he admitted he went inside briefly to look for Charlie, slipped in blood, and braced himself against the wall. He insisted he never hurt anyone. Realizing something terrible had happened, Mark ran back to his car. That, he claimed, was how Tony's blood got in his vehicle. But he couldn't explain how the boy's blood got on his underwear. So, 29-year-old Mark Serrano and 33-year-old Charles Gilio were formally charged with murder in connection with the deaths of the Mori family. Both men pleaded not guilty. While the case moved to pre-trial proceedings, they were held without bail. When news of the arrests broke, the people of Fishkill were stunned. The whole town had been anxiously waiting to learn which of the two men was responsible for such a horrific act against 5 innocent people everyone knew and loved. Now the authorities' job was to ensure the person who committed such violence would never walk free again. Hundreds attended the memorial service for the 5 members of the Mori family at a Fishkill church. Classmates, teachers, neighbors, friends, and strangers touched by the tragedy came to pay their respects. Photos of Tony, Tina, and their 3 sons hung everywhere in the church. Handwritten messages from classmates to the boys covered one wall. Sadly, tragedies like this bring communities together. Mark Serrano's trial began in November 2007. The courtroom was packed. Media filled the room, camera flashes everywhere. Prosecutors laid out a chilling story to the jury. With horrifying clarity, they described the brutality inflicted on the Mori family, including 3 minor boys. Many jurors cried listening to the prosecution. Here's what happened that fateful night, according to the defendant's own admission. On January 18th, he and Charlie spent most of the day in the car drinking and snorting coke. Around 10 p.m., they met their weed dealer. Then Charlie suggested driving to Tony's to buy more coke. Charlie went into the Mory house first, alone. About 10 minutes later, Mark followed and saw the 2 men talking in the living room. At some point, Charlie pulled a gun from his hoodie pocket, pointed it straight at Tony's face, and fired. Tina pushed Charlie away and rushed to help her husband. Gilio then walked up to Tina and shot her 3 times. Mark Serrano panicked, ran out of the living room, got in his car, and drove home. There he changed clothes and did more coke to calm down. About an hour and a half later, Mark returned to the Mory house to pick up Charlie. Peeking into one of the bedrooms, he saw a little boy lying motionless on the bed. When Serrano touched the child's leg, he saw a huge pool of blood underneath. Panicking, he braced his hand against the wall, then bolted outside. He then saw Charlie coming out of the house with an empty gas can. Gilio got into Tony's Kia, drove a short distance, and set the car on fire. Afterward, Mark drove Charlie home. Serrano continued to insist he never killed anyone. Nevertheless, after deliberating, the jury returned its verdict. Mark was found guilty on all 31 counts. The judge sentenced him to 50 years in prison. He will be eligible for parole in 2056. Charles Gilio's trial took place in 2008. The defendant remained calm, controlled, and mostly silent. Defense attorneys claimed the real villain was Mark Serrano and that he dragged Charlie into the crime. But testimony from a witness to whom Charlie personally confessed everything changed the case. The witness was the same drug dealer Mark and Charlie had met the night before. Gilio called him early that morning, before the attack was public, and said the entire Mori family was dead. Charlie said he killed the youngest first and made the father watch. Then he finished off Tony, Tina, and the other 2 boys. Previously convicted Mark Serrano also testified. He told the jury that tension between Charlie and Tony had grown. That night, angry at his childhood friend, Gilio suggested robbing Tony's house. Murder was never part of the plan. But everything went wrong. To cover the crime, Charlie set the house on fire, and then his so-called brother Tony's car. Charles Gilio was sentenced to 5 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. He will spend the rest of his days behind bars. Charles Gilio and Tony Mory once called each other brothers, but when drugs entered the picture, that friendship vanished. Tony's 3 sons saw Charlie as an uncle, and he literally stabbed them in the back. Manuel Mory, Tony's father, lost all will to live after his son and grandsons were gone. It was as if he waited only until the killers were brought to justice. A few months after the trials, in May 2008, he passed away. He was only 57. It was over. His family was gone. First, his wife died after a long illness, then his son, daughter-in-law, and 3 grandsons. There was nothing left for Manuel on this earth. Help this channel grow. Like the video, try the new hype feature, leave a comment, and subscribe for more stories. This helps us a lot. Thank you.